Hi, everyone. This week, we're going to look at, in particular, the mystical medieval movement at its height, but also the scholastic movement as well, the relationship between the two, and how both of these movements actually brought about renewal in the church when it was needed most. So, there was certainly, as a result of corruption, schism in the church, and war, a growing dissatisfaction within the church. This, as a result, brought about a number of different groups, certain monastic groups, mystical groups, and evangelistic leaders that brought about significant rule during this time period. Um, certainly, there were other monastic movements that began to emerge during this time. In particular, you had the friars. They uh, they did not set up communities, but rather they lived among the people and preached in the vernacular languages. But there were two types of friars during this time in the medieval period. There were the Franciscan friars, the followers of Francis of Assisi, who we'll talk about in a minute. But they went to Spain, Egypt, China, eventually to the West. They were a missionary order that appealed to the heart, and they were exceptionally evangelistic in spreading the gospel. The Dominican order were scholars and apologists who defended Christianity against heresy. Thomas Aquinas was the most famous among this group of monks, and we'll mention him in a minute as well. But let's begin with what I think are four of the most significant people during this time period. You have Bernard of Clairvaux at the very beginning of the 12th century, who was a spiritual leader of the church at that time. He emphasized, some point to him certainly as helping to make an appeal to the start of what is called the Second Crusade in the history of the church, but more importantly, for renewal purposes, he emphasized the role of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and the presence of Christ and the Holy Spirit uh, to to lead us and guide us. He was a very prophetic leader of his time period. Um, you also have Francis of Assisi. He's pictured here holding a dove, which is symbolic for two reasons. He's the patron saint of animals, and a lot of history written about him and his relationship with animals. But the dove is certainly also a symbol of the Holy Spirit. He was probably the most spirit-filled individual that we can find in this period, or at least one of the most. He spoke in tongues. He was prophetic, used in the gifts of the Spirit frequently. As I mentioned earlier, as the founder of the Franciscan movement, monastic movement, um, he was also a very evangelistic person. He actually went on a crusade and was completely disillusioned. Came back, was ill for a period of time when God miraculously healed him, and then he devoted the rest of his life, made a vow to poverty, devoted the rest of his life to evangelism. It is said that when he went to Egypt to preach the gospel, that the Caliphate of Egypt said, "If all Christians were like you, I would certainly convert to Christ." And he was a very effective evangelist and of his time period. Thomas Aquinas, he was the most influential theologian of the medieval period. Much of Roman Catholic theology then and even to today was centered around Thomistic theology. His medieval theology as a leader in the scholastic movement was significant, but he was also someone who believed in the role of faith, the importance of the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit to lead us and guide us, which is something that is often minimized by his influence in the scholastic movement. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Catherine of Siena, who by many accounts was certainly the most prophetic and certainly one of the most influential leaders of this period. It is said often that she really was the spiritual leader in the latter part of this period, really going into the 15th century during during what is called the Great Schism, where the Western Church, was severely divided between three popes. She was an incredible prophetic leader, frequently saw visions from God, frequently prophesied over the church, and it is said that she truly was the female pope that united the church at that time period and brought it back together. Um, but there were other significant movements that occurred during this time. Some of them were reform movements outside of the church and often declared as heretical. The first of these is the Cathari, who were very charismatic, very spirit filled. Um, Many of them compare them, rightly or wrongly, with earlier Gnostic movements. They emphasized an ascetic form of holiness, but more importantly, they certainly for Protestant reformers, they placed their authority on the New Testament and not on the Pope. But they also emphasized and expressed a wide variety of spiritual gifts and emphasized the role of the Holy Spirit. However, they were largely eliminated during what is called the Albigensian Crusade of 1209. Um, the Waldensian movement, founded by Peter Waldo in the latter part of the 12th century, believed that everyone should have the Bible in his own language, and the Bible is the final authority in all things. He was excommunicated, but a small movement of Waldensians still exists today in northern Italy. There was also the Joachim movement, which was a widely popular movement in the latter part of this period, founded by Joachim of Fiore. It emphasized the end times. He had he had a lot of eschatological writings, but he believed in three ages: the age of the Father, which was the Old Testament era; the age of the Son, which he believed was the New Testament period, which would go until 1260, and then, of course, the age of the Holy Spirit until the return of Christ. And that's why his movement gained a lot of popularity at that time period, especially because of all the division in the church and a lot of people believing that with the Black Plague and other occurrences going on, that the end of the world was coming and the return of Christ was coming. But because his emphasis of the age of the Holy Spirit, this movement was also very much a renewal movement that emphasized the presence of Christ, the presence of the Holy Spirit, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Um, there were, however, two primary movements in the medieval church during this period in medieval Christianity. The first one is called Scholasticism, and the second one is called Mysticism, and we'll look at them both. But first of all, we begin with Scholasticism, which really began first. It attempted to rationalize theology in order to buttress or support faith through reason. And in a way, it's much like the challenge the modern church faced in harmonizing modern scientific discovery with biblical doctrine. Um, but it focused on harmonizing the natural philosophy of Aristotle, gathered by rational processes, with a revealed theology of the Bible. It really began with a revival of the philosophy of Aristotle, which became popular in Europe around 1200 through the influence of both an Arab and a Jewish philosopher of that time period. But the new monastic orders of that time period, the Dominicans and the Franciscans that I already talked about earlier, were interested in using philosophy in the study of biblical revelation. But more importantly, it was really the expansion of the modern university movement, which began at that time, which helped spread and expand scholasticism during that period. Well, we're about out of time for this part of this lecture. We'll continue with the second part here in a minute.